The Perils of Being Bipedal by Bruce Latimer, Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Humans are unique among mammals that we walk in a most peculiar way, on our extended hind limbs. Indeed, as far as we know, no other mammal species save our immediate ancestors has ever even experimented with this bizarre method of locomoting. This is perhaps not altogether surprising in light of the fact that the fastest human on earth cannot beat a rabbit in a 100-meter dash. Humans are not notoriously slow runners. They also are prone to numerous musculoskeletal injuries that do not plague other mammals. This article will address this latter issue, that is, the role that a human walking plays in the etiology of several human conditions. The evolutionary shift to upright human-like walking is quite ancient, with fossil evidence suggesting that it occurred somewhere between 6 to 8 million years before present. Walking upright is thus not only rare and an adaptation of long-standing, it likely is the breakthrough adaptation of the lineage that eventually led to modern Homo sapiens. Associated with the transition to bipedality are a host of obvious musculoskeletal modifications, rendering the adaptation itself relatively easy to recognize, even from rather scant paleontological evidence. This means that the evolution of bipedality can be closely followed through the existing fossil record. The end result is that modern human postcranial skeleton differs markedly from our closest biological cousin, the chimpanzee. Most of the major differences we see between the postcranial skeletons of contemporary apes and humans are directly related to the reorganizations made to accommodate the kinematic and kinetic consequences of force transmission during locomotion. In standing habitually upright, humans have redirected the gravity vector some 90 degrees from where it was in our pre-vertically oriented ancestor. This alteration has had profound anatomical implications. It has, moreover, created a novel mechanical environment which has, in turn, led to numerous problems or maladies that are similarly unique to humans. The following will examine some of these conditions, particularly in the human foot. We will also consider the possible relation between habitual bipedality and the systemic condition known as age-related osteopenia or osteoporosis, a condition that naturally occurs among mammals only in humans. Indeed, it is unfortunate but true that if we long enough, nearly all of us will suffer from being bipedal. Not just aching feet, sprained ankles or arthritic knees and hips, but a whole host of conditions that are unique to our species, as is our peculiar way of walking. For example, only our species regularly endures such common maladies as fractured hips, bunions, hernias, inguinal and femoral, fallen arches, torn menisci, shin splints, herniated intervertebral disc, fractured vertebrae, spondylolysis, scoliosis, and kyphosis, just to name a few. Why among mammals, including our cousins, the chimpanzee and the gorilla, do we alone suffer these debilitating problems? The answer can be found in evolution, the process that allows us to understand how we developed into what we are today. Before progressing, it is valuable to briefly discuss the approach taken here. The question of modern human musculoskeletal anatomy is seen from the point of view of comparative anatomy, especially that of higher primates. It is important to keep in mind that comparing and contrasting the anatomy of modern African apes and humans is to focus on the endpoints of evolution. In order to address the stages that led to what we see today and to reconstruct the selective agents responsible, it is necessary to examine the fossil record. Therefore, we will also examine the evolutionary history of our own species, looking for clues that may shed light on our present condition, especially contemporary problems whose etiology is related to two-legged upright walking. As noted, the skeletal modifications related to the transition to bipedality are relatively easy to recognize, and we can analyze these modifications with respect to the probable mechanical role each change had during the emergence from a non-bipedal ancestor. Any dramatic skeletal features found in humans or our ancestors but not present in chimpanzees or gorillas are likely to be important in the overall functioning of the animal. This method of analyzing contemporary clinical conditions from an evolutionary perspective has been called an adaptive or evolutionary approach. Impulse production and energy dissipation. It is clear that in order to move effectively across a terrestrial substrate, there must be adequate friction between the animal and the ground, and that the animal in question must be able to produce adequate substrate reaction forces necessary for propulsion. An additional but equally crucial factor is the animal's ability to insulate itself from the high and potentially damaging loads imposed during the locomotor process. This latter point is especially critical in large-bodied mammals like humans. Indeed, it is likely that many of the anatomical features we see in the human lower limb were originally selected to protect soft tissue structures like non-renewable cartilaginous articular surfaces from the damaging effects of high substrate reaction forces. In contrast to a biped, a typical quadrupedal mammal has several mechanisms that are available to dissipate these loads. Among the most important is the ability of the forelimb to utilize eccentric contraction of the triceps muscles across the elbow during the support phase of gait. The triceps has a high cross-sectional area. Its contraction can be phased over a significant time period of forefoot contact, and a short movement arm requires only a minimal vertical translation of body mass. Additional forelimb muscles ideally suited for a similar function include the serratus magnus, one of the large muscles connecting the scapula to the thoracic wall. Both of these forelimb articular complexes are excellent energy absorbers that protect the animal from what would otherwise be damaging forces. It does not require much imagination to see that human bipedality has resulted in the complete forfeiture of these important energy absorbing mechanisms. Indeed, human walking imposes tasks upon our hind limbs that are normally shared by both hind and forelimbs in quadrupedal animals. During running and fast walking, transarticular forces in the human lower limb may approach several multiples of body weight. Upon once having stood up, the human lower limb must play the role of an impulse producer and simultaneously must be an effective energy absorber. This task, however, is made difficult by our orthograde, upright posture. It is not enough that we concentrate forces during the single limb support phase, but we have the additional factor of doing this on an extended limb. Excessive flexion on the knee during support phase would allow effective dissipation of the kinetic energy through eccentric contraction of the large quadriceps muscles, but would at the same time result in large vertical oscillations of the trunk center of mass. This in turn would result in rapid fatigue of the quadriceps as well as the additional heat load of the body. Try walking with bent knee gait for a couple of 100 yards if you doubt this principle. While this on a level substrate, the knee does undergo a small amount of flexion, approximately 15 degrees. The eccentric contraction of the quadriceps allows the necessary levels of force dissipation. This mechanism is especially important at heel strike. However, when energy levels rise, as when running, rapidly changing directions, or negotiating significant grades, the energy absorption function of the lower limb is compromised by the requirement that the limb remain near full extension. In view of the fact that the locomotor skeletons of our ancestors were adapted to high energy levels, this scenario highlights the compromised adaptation of the human lower limb, impulse producer and energy absorber, as well as significant dangers imposed by two-legged walking. The human foot. As noted, single limb stance on a nearly extended lower limb not only concentrates the force but also acts to diminish the limb's ability to dissipate loads through eccentric contraction of the surrounding muscles. Several uniquely human adaptations have arisen in the face of these challenges. One of these is the human pedal arc. The human foot is, among primates, highly unusual in that the hallux or great toe is permanently directed anteriorly and is in line with the remainder of the digits. To achieve this configuration, humans and our ancestors necessarily relinquished a grasping foot, severely compromising the ability to climb. Indeed, humans and our closely related ancestors are the only species among living and extinct primates to have sacrificed the grasping foot. The thumb-like grasping hallux seen in all other living primates is the most conservative of all primitive anatomical adaptations and is closely associated with the defining primate characteristic, tree climbing. The dramatic anatomical modifications seen in the human foot represent a vital evolutionary adaptation indicating that terrestrial bipedality had supplied tree climbing as a way of life. The foot plays two crucial roles in upright bipedality. First, it is a propulsive lever during impulse production. Second, it also serves as an energy dissipator during force-generating situations such as leaping, running, and jumping. It is this latter function, force dissipation, which led to the permanent abduction of the human great toe, the creation of the longitudinal arc in the foot, and as a consequence, the abandonment of climbing. During the stance phase of human gait, the foot is in contact with the substrate in three primary areas, most distally from foot flat to toe off. As the body passes anteriorly over the foot and the heel is raised, the portion of the foot in contact with the ground consists of the metatarsal heads and phalanges. While in this position, the foot is in relative plantar flexion, and because the suprajacent body tends to force dorsiflexion, eccentric contraction of the triceps surae muscles acts as an extremely effective energy dissipator. The triceps surae is, however, unable to participate in energy absorption during the foot flat when the metatarsal heads and the calcaneus are both in contact with the substrate. In this position, the ground reaction will force a reduced concavity along the longitudinal and transverse arches, allowing eccentric contraction of the intrinsic muscles of the foot as well as an elongation of the passive structures like the spring ligament. To the chagrin of many medical students, the human foot has more intrinsic muscles than does the human hand. Clearly, however, the foot is not the agile and highly mobile structure that the human hand is. The strong pennation of the intrinsic foot muscles indicates that rather than mobility, these muscles are adapted to powerful short contractile distances, which is to say eccentric contraction and energy dissipation. The functional role of the human arc is, as described above, energy absorption during single limb support. An alternative point of view has described the arc as an elastic energy store that is important for energy recovery during human running. This mechanism and the morphology associated with it are seen only in humans and our ancestors. The 3.5 million years before present Australopithecine footprints at the Tanzanian site of Laetoli demonstrate conclusively that the pedal arc with its associated anatomical changes are among the earliest of bipedal adaptations. These footprints of three Lucy-like individuals walking along the margin of what we now call the Serengeti Plain are strikingly human in conformation. Indeed, they have no features that would in any way attract the attention on a modern-day beach. In addition, fossils from the Ethiopian site of Hadar, where the famous Lucy was discovered, indicate clearly that 3.5 million years ago, no grasping movements were possible at the hallucer-tarsometatarsal joint, and that the great toe was permanently abducted and aligned with the long axis of the foot. The effectiveness of the human pedal arc as a shock absorber is readily apparent when viewing the pathological conditions that occur in its absence. The old saw about flat-footed individuals not being allowed to join the infantry rings true. Without an arc and the protection it provides, the soldiers forced to march long distances will develop fatigue fractures on the metatarsals, the fibula, and the tibia. Other maladies that occur only in humans are plantar fasciitis and the development of heel spurs. Both of these conditions result from repeated tensions on the plantar aponeurosis, a strong inelastic ligamentous structure that stretches from the plantar margin of the calcaneus to the bases of proximal phalanges. The plantar aponeurosis becomes taut as the body passes over the foot and the toes are passively forced into dorsiflexion. This helps support the arc, and this function is described as the windlass action undergoes. Inflammation of the plantar aponeurosis is a common ailment among athletes, especially long-distance runners. The attachment site for the aponeurosis on the margin of the calcaneus is where heel spurs commonly develop. The arc supporting mechanism provided by aponeurosis can only function in the human foot, with its great toe permanently in line with the foot's long axis. The pedal arc with its attendant anatomical features is seen only in humans and our ancestors. Additional pathological conditions that beset only human bipeds are also associated with the arc. Included are such conditions as hallux valgus and hallux varus, problems wherein the metatarsal of the great toe is forced out of its normal antero-posterior alignment. This creates bunions as well as disorders related to the misalignment of the flexor tendons and consequent pathological problems related to misalignment of the sesamoid bones. Because only humans among modern mammals have an arc, they are alone in suffering the flat feet or pes planus. Although no evidence exists regarding the presence of these conditions in our early bipedal ancestors, given that contemporary humans continue to suffer, it seems quite likely that they too were beset by these maladies. osteopenia, and bipedality. Age-related bone loss occurs regularly only in humans. This situation is especially problematic when it leads to a series of characteristic skeletal fractures and the condition known as osteoporosis. Neither the bone mineral loss nor the resultant fractures are seen in the African apes. The remainder of this article will discuss the possibility of an etiological relationship between the adaptations to habitual bipedality and the age-related bone mineral loss. As described, the ground reaction forces that occur during toe-off and foot flat are effectively resolved by eccentric contraction of the powerful triceps surae and the pedal arc musculature respectively. However, during the earliest period of stance phase heel strike, these mechanisms are rendered ineffectual. Because the initial contact point with the ground is the heel, which lies posterior to the ankle joint, the foot is forced into plantar flexion by the momentum of the body. At this point, the anterior tibial muscles, the dorsiflexors, are in a position to eccentrically contract, which they do as they control the descent of the foot onto the ground. However, unlike the large and powerful triceps surae, the dorsiflexors have a much smaller cross-sectional areas and operate with lower leverage ratios because of their restraining reticula. High loads are frequently experienced by the lower limb at heel strike, and the 15 degree of knee flexion at this point in the gait cycle permits the quadriceps muscle to eccentrically contract, acting as a shock absorber. In view of this important protective mechanism, it is likely that significant asynchrony of heel strike and knee flexion is etiologically related to idiopathic arthritis of the knee and hip joints. While this mechanism usually works effectively to attenuate ground reaction and serves to protect the articular cartilages, its effectiveness is, as noted above, seriously constrained by the necessity of maintaining an extended limb. Because of the high loads imposed during heel strike and difficulty of resolving them, the human calcaneus demonstrates a number of unique adaptations. First, the human calcaneus is, relative to body size, the largest heel bone of any mammal. For example, a 350-pound male gorilla has the calcaneus with a smaller cross-section than does a human female weighing 100 pounds. Second, while the ape calcaneus is characterized by thick cortex and heavy structural trabeculae in response to bending loads imposed by the triceps surae, the human heel bone is covered in paper with thin cortical bone and is full of thin, attenuated trabeculae. Thus, humans have calcaneae with expanded cross-section, vastly greater amounts of cancellous bone, and much less cortical bone. These changes mean that the human heel bone, while larger, is overall less dense. In order to achieve these changes, humans and our ancestors added a novel structure to the calcaneal tuber, the lateral plantar process. No other living primate has this anatomical feature. It is, moreover, an early adaptation in that it is clearly apparent in the 3.5 million year old Ethiopian fossils. The dramatic increase in the total cancellous bone volume occurs not just in the heel, but in all the primary joints of the human lower limb. It is especially apparent in the expanded metaphysis of the human ankle and knee joints. These adaptations are also seen in the 4 million year old hominid fossils from Kenya. Such skeletal modifications represent important mechanical adaptations because of the comparatively low elastic modulus of cancellous bone. Because work performed on the lower limb during heel strike, that is, strain energy stored up to the yield point, is proportional to the volume of the composite structures. The changes discussed for the human calcaneus, ankle and knee joints have the effect of increasing the energy storage capacity of the leg. Moreover, since elastic modulus increases with the cube of apparent density, any reduction in apparent density in humans would serve to further lower the elastic modulus, further increasing the potential energy storage. All the changes are seen only in humans and our bipedal ancestors and are the result of walking upright on an extended hind limb. A consequence of these lower limb modifications for load attenuation is the vast increase in skeletal surface area. Although chimps and humans share, relative to body size, similar amounts of skeletal tissue, the redistribution in humans from cortical to cancellous bone, as well as the thinner and longer individual trabeculae, means that humans have vastly greater surface exposure of skeletal tissue. Because the flux of mineral into and out of bone is partially a function of surface area, the increased surface area in the human skeletal can, in the face of age-related changes in the endocrine system, result in an accelerated rate of bone mineral loss in humans. Clearly, our ancestors did not live long enough for this to have become an issue. However, current demographic trends will have the effect of altering what was once a positive adaptation for bipedality into a serious sequelae of pathological conditions among the elderly. That is, what once was adapted to protect the skeletal systems of young animals in high energy environments now acts to degrade the skeletons of aged skeletons in low energy regimes. Conclusion. Human bipedality is an ancient adaptation, and it is the evolutionary transition that eventually led to our leaving footprints on the moon. Associated with upright walking and the positive advantages that come with freeing the upper limbs of the responsibilities of locomotion are a number of related conditions that are somewhat less desirable. Several of these are described above. Most of these problems were never selected, either for or against, and they are simply a mechanical consequence of how we walk. We retain the basic musculoskeletal system of a mammalian quadruped, but have imposed upon it a novel loading regime. Many of the problems result relatively late in life or are the result of a cyclic trauma. Evolution does not and cannot select for perfection. All major evolutionary adaptations are compromises between selective advantages and disadvantages. Bipedal walking is the hallmark of our lineage. It is a great advantage, albeit one fraught with potential problems.